Today, we'll be discussing the case of Edgewater Medical Center. Edgewater was a hospital that was ahead of its time. It was literally built to resemble a five-star resort. It had all types of amenities. It was very beautiful. It had expensive equipment. Many people, including celebrities, flew themselves out simply to get treated at this hospital. It was meant to be the best of the best. However, Edgewater rather turned out to be possibly one of the worst, because it was at this hospital a gigantic scheme would be run for several years and thousands of patients would be harmed along the way. Staff members were doing tests and procedures on people who didn't need them. Seniors who weren't sick were hospitalized, and several people were paid to fake illnesses in order for the hospital to make a whopping profit. Many were indicted, and this hospital was left in Chicago as one of the most eerie buildings to exist. And we're going to be taking a very deep dive into the 5 doctors and 1 CEO who came together to make this sick scam a possibility. This one is a wild one, so you're really going to have to bear with me through all these twists and turns in the case. I'd like to thank hosts Stephanie Young and Todd Gans from the If the Walls Could Talk podcast for the extensive research they put into this case. It was through their podcast I was able to gather the majority of this information, so I would strongly recommend taking a listen to their episodes and supporting their page and Patreon if you'd like to hear all the full details regarding this case. Their information will be in my description. This case was actually suggested by a subscriber as well, so thank you for suggesting this case. And just to introduce myself, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything medical, mysteries, and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. Alright, let's get into this case. Edgewater Hospital, located in Chicago, had its grand opening on January 6, 1929, and it was quite the hospital to be, because after 2 years of planning and 8 months of construction, it wasn't just your typical hospital, but it was essentially a near 5-star hotel. The hospital was very elegant and luxurious, and they even employed page boys, bellhops, and greeters. Not only this, but they were equipped with the best medical technology for the time. This included telephones, paging systems, an emergency lighting system, headphones for central radios in every room, and several x-ray and sterilizing machines. They built the rooms and hallways with the nicest materials, and they had luxuries like a rooftop solarium, a kitchen headed by a local chef, a hydrotherapy room with the latest of bath and massage equipment, and a physiotherapy department that specialized in light treatments. There wasn't a hospital that far north of Chicago, so it was a big deal that Edgewater was created. Several older A-list celebrities often flew to the hospital to be treated. This included Bing Crosby, Jimmy Stewart, and Frank Sinatra. They would often stay in these large suites and that had sterling silverware, a bar, dining tables, and they were even treated to a tea service. Hillary Clinton was born at this hospital. Something also interestingly notable is that John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born at Edgewater. If you don't know who Gacy is, he was a man who committed some very horrific crimes, and he was famous for his character Pogo the Clown. Pogo because he was Polish and on the go. And what's wild is that he actually, in fact, visited local hospitals, including Edgewater, to entertain sick children as this clown while simultaneously committing horrible crimes against people. Now, because there's a lot to unpack, it's only right to start off this video by introducing Edgewater's many doctors, starting with co-founder Dr. Maurice Mazel. Dr. Mazel was born January 12th, 1895, and was a prominent heart surgeon in the city of Chicago. He was a board member, resident physician, co-founder of Edgewater, being there since its opening in 1929 when he was 33 years old, and leading the hospital until he passed in 1980 at 85 years old. Dr. Mazel loved his work. He was described as a brilliant doctor and a businessman who was compassionate towards his employees, his patients, and was dedicated to his practice. He had a philosophy that patients come first, and he seemed to stick by this. While Mazel was quite loved, especially by patients, He was also known as being a perfectionist, which many did complain about. He would often come in at 3 a.m. to round on patients and perform many spot checks on staff members. If staff weren't working right when he checked, or if there was even something slightly wrong, like a curtain being off of one of the hooks, they would get in big trouble. It was said he had a bad temper and would fire people on the spot for doing something wrong. A staff member by the name of Roger Ehmen was so concerned about the number of staff being fired regularly, and because of this, he sent a resignation letter to Dr. Mazel. But instead of accepting this like a normal employer, Dr. Mazel called Roger into his office, used a button under his desk to lock the door, and told him, "I'm not letting you leave here." You'll see later on the role Roger played in the many frauds and schemes going on at this hospital. Now, the staff at Edgewater was very diverse. They often recruited doctors from England, Scotland, and the Philippines. There was a physician named Dr. Manulet who moved from Cuba to the US to practice medicine. And there was also Dr. Andrew Cubria, who too moved from Cuba to the US to practice medicine. He was board certified in cardiology and internal medicine and was described as a good physician who later became greedy. During the 1950s, Dr. Mazel gained recognition as a cardiac surgeon after developing a form of open heart surgery used around the world for over 12 years. And he even manufactured a blood clot drug known as urokinase, which is made from healthy male urine, 350 gallons of urine to be exact, collected from male patients staying at the hospital, and 3 weeks of processing made it enough to treat one patient. Around this time, between 1952 and 1963, the hospital was able to make various expansions, including the addition of a hyperbaric chamber, which was one of only 3 in the Chicago area. With a hyperbaric chamber, patients lie in an enclosed chamber which resembles a tanning bed. Once inside, the air pressure inside is then raised to a higher level than normal air pressure, and this increased air pressure in the chamber helps the lungs collect more oxygen, which is useful because getting more oxygen to the tissues that need it can help the body heal and fight certain infections. And patients were being sent all around the Midwest to utilize inhalation therapy in this chamber they now had. However, while Edgewater was making all of these new expansions, they also happened to find themselves in their first public scandal. And this was because Dr. Mazel was found to actually have received kickbacks from the hospital's industrial contracts. It was in 1963 when a jury found Mazel guilty and he was charged with fraud and tax evasion. And this would be the first of many fraud charges here at Edgewater. During the 1980s, healthcare began to change, and Dr. Mazel, approaching his 80s at the time, was asked to merge with other hospitals to ensure the growth and stability of Edgewater. However, he continuously refused, saying he didn't care what happened to the hospital after he was gone. And shortly later, at the age of 85, he passed away from complications following an intestinal surgery. Many people came to Dr. Mazel's funeral, and he was quite missed. However, with the leadership of Dr. Mazel gone, the hospital quickly fell apart, and the management fell to Dr. Mazel's widow, Harriet, who was a former circus performer. Throughout the 1980s, Edgewater Hospital struggled without Dr. Mazel. In just 1 year, between 1988 and 1989, the hospital lost more than $18 million, which is the equivalent to $42 million today. At the same time, because there were so many changes to the healthcare structure in the US at the time, this resulted in the Blue Cross organization providing coverage for not all the services as they were doing before. So by then, the financial risk shifted to hospitals and doctors, and as a result, the mentality changed to get them in, get them well, get them out. Medicine became a hardcore business and was a lucrative way for health facilities to make money. Because of this new business mentality, Edgewater tried to keep up by attracting younger patients, and they thought a good way to do this was to add an elaborate birthing center. This plan, however, failed and was rather laughed at by most other organizations, At this point, the atmosphere around the hospital became very lazy, dreary, tense, and unwelcoming, and it was said that the spirit of the hospital died. Not only this, but the hospital began to lose money fast. It was so bad to the point there were rumors of embezzlement beginning to spread as money seemed to just disappear, like genuinely be gone. Several other hospitals in the Chicago area began closing, and Edgewater, without a buyer or a merger, was warned that they would be next. That, of course, was until a man named Peter Rogan came through and saved the hospital from foreclosure, buying Edgewater for $1 million. And this was one of the greatest things to happen to the hospital because under Peter's leadership, the hospital took a complete 180. In just 1 year, they finally began making a profit again. And so many people hailed Peter Rogan as a savior for this successful turnaround. But in reality, what some people didn't know was that Peter was not a savior. He was in fact rather a greedy liar. Peter was described as being someone who appeared nice on the surface. It appeared that he never did anything overtly wrong, but he was also someone who can never be trusted. He wasn't what people would describe as friendly, but was rather sneaky or standoffish. He was a micromanager who had a quick temper, and he was someone who would only be loyal to you if he thought you were loyal to him. Peter was very well off, and I mean, he had a lot of money. He was always well dressed, and he would actually often have meetings with the nursing staff of the hospitals on his yacht. It was said that he even would often say things like, quote, "I don't care if we get sued, I have more money than they do, and I will tie them up in court." Peter liked to be called Dr. Peter Rogan. He didn't have a medical degree. He was not a medical doctor, but he did have a PhD in hospital and healthcare administration. For several years, he worked as a healthcare consultant at a company formerly known as Ernst and Young, now called EY. This is a company that provides various services, including accounting, consulting, law, tax, strategy, and assurance to clients. The company ranks among PwC, KPMG, and Deloitte as a member of the Big Four accounting firms. In addition to being a healthcare consultant here, Peter also spent a few years working as a CEO at a hospital in Northwest Indiana. But eventually, the government board asked Peter to resign from the Indiana hospital, and so he did just that. I'm not fully sure why he was asked to resign, but I do know when he left, he hired many of his former employees from the Indiana hospital to work at Edgewater. At Edgewater, Peter began slashing expenses. He cut the hospital's daycare and maternity ward. He eliminated the private rooms and page boys, and he got rid of a lot of their high-tech equipment, opting to use more substandard equipment. This was all part of his plan. He didn't want it to be a 5-star hotel targeting younger families anymore. He instead wanted to shift the hospital's focus from targeting the rich and famous to targeting senior citizens, particularly senior citizens on Medicare. Remember how I briefly mentioned Roger Ehmen? Well, at Edgewater, Peter promoted Roger to Vice President of Medical Staff Development, Marketing, and Public Relations. This made him the number 2 guy at the hospital, just below Peter, who was the number 1. Roger was described as being the good cop and quite literally the opposite of Peter. He wore a warm smile and he was the nice guy who always wanted to please everyone. Thing is, he was not only supportive, but he was completely submissive to whatever Peter said, which must have been relatively true as several hospital staff said they believed Peter often pushed Roger into things that he didn't want to do. In the 1990s, Peter had a plan to continue making the hospital a lot of money. Around this time, the hospital was entirely focused on making a profit. They often rented it out to shoot movies, they filmed TV shows, and they even shot music videos. Some notable mentions is the action thriller movie Backdraft, which had scenes filmed here, as well as the thriller drama Losing Isaiah. And these are some pretty big movies. I mean, just by looking at the directors and the cast list, these movies featured plenty of A-list well-known actors and made quite the hefty profit. Not only this, but Peter also added more doctors and primary care physicians to attract more patients, because more patients equals more money. And he was quite successful with this because there was a 24% increase in the number of patients. It also helped that Edgewater just so happened to be extremely expensive. It was actually the most expensive hospital in Chicago, which was unusual since most expensive hospitals were teaching hospitals, i.e., hospitals that do research. Edgewater was not. The hospital's profits were in fact so large that it was only in 1994 when Peter decided to cash out and sold the hospital for $35 million. But this didn't mean he was done with Edgewater, not even in the slightest, because Peter continued to make money off of the hospital. A management company literally owned by Peter Rogan had taken over the hospital's operations, and his management company charged way more than most management companies to run the hospital. Not only this, but Peter bought many of the buildings and parking lots surrounding the hospital just to rent them back to the hospital. Now, as mentioned, Peter had shifted the focus from attracting younger patients to attracting senior citizens on Medicare. This worked out in his favor because the senior citizens who fueled the hospital's turnaround came from low-income housing on Chicago's South Side, which were communities far from Edgewater. There would be a hospital van that transported them from the senior citizen home to Edgewater, which was the furthest hospital north in the city. And these patients were offered free health services, clinics, as well as freebies such as free limo rides to and from surgeries, cigarettes, and a free meal. Busloads of seniors would arrive each day, and this notably mainly consisted of Black or African American women. This is where some of the more twisted parts of the case began to occur, because it would be when these patients arrived at the hospital when Edgewater doctors would tell them they had much more serious health conditions than they knew. But in reality, several of these doctors were in fact lying. This was all part of a ploy to get these patients to stay and go through a ridiculous amount of unnecessary procedures so the hospital can get a hefty check. Some hospital staff even grew suspicious about this because seniors who weren't sick were immediately admitted into the hospital, and they were often placed on what was called the mysterious second floor. The second floor was, quote, the dirty little secret that no one was supposed to discuss. It had its own dedicated medical staff, and no other nurses were allowed. No one talked about the patients on the second floor. Even the families of those second floor patients had no idea where they were and often reached out to local radio stations asking for help in finding their missing loved ones. The second floor doctors ran multiple tests on these patients and never told them what was going on, nor did they tell them what was supposedly wrong with them. And what was wild was sometimes the goal wasn't even just to make money, but sometimes the goal of placing these patients on the second floor was to quite literally take away their homes. To explain, if the manager of a Chicago housing authority or a CHA building, which is a form of public housing, were to have an issue with one of their elder tenants, for example, if they weren't paying their bills on time or if they weren't taking care of their apartment, the manager would drive these people to Edgewater saying there was something wrong with them. Doctors would then keep the patients for the necessary 3-day stay before being allowed to put them in a nursing home, thus getting them kicked out of their public housing. The doctors would then call the manager of the CHA building saying they could get rid of the patient's apartment since they were now in a nursing home. So they were pretty much kidnapping these patients. There was one moment in particular one day where Peter Rogan told a primary care physician named Dr. G that admissions were down, and because of this, he needed to admit more patients. But Dr. G wasn't feeling that, and he actually was appalled that Peter would say or even have an idea like that. And so he voiced his concerns regarding the hospital's shady operations and told him, hey, I don't think that's cool. And it wasn't long after this incident when Dr. G was out of town and one of his patients was admitted to Edgewater without his knowledge. During this admission, someone had forged Dr. G's signature on a document regarding this patient. And when Dr. G complained about the admission issue, they immediately fired him and threw him out of the hospital before he can even collect his belongings. With at least one known enemy now out of the way, doctors at Edgewater continued their shady practices. They would even often recommend invasive, expensive, and unnecessary treatment forms without performing the appropriate tests to even determine whether they were needed or not. For example, one patient complaining of stomach pain was told that she needed a hysterectomy, despite the doctor not performing any formal examinations on her. Likewise, one patient who simply had a toenail infection was told that he needed to have his foot amputated. One of the ways Edgewater attracted many people in the area was by offering free healthcare screenings. However, after they'd performed these screenings, these people would be told they needed invasive and sometimes fatal procedures, even when they didn't. Edgewater would also hire patient recruiters, i.e. salesmen, who would mainly target people struggling with homelessness or drug addiction. These recruiters would pass out flyers that offered treatment for a list of symptoms, and when interested people called, the recruiters would arrange transportation to Edgewater for staff members to pull their shady tricks. Recruiters sometimes even bribed these people to come to Edgewater in exchange for things like money, candy, or cigarettes. But of course, all shady practices must come to an end, because what they didn't know was the FBI had begun an investigation into the Edgewater hospital. So it's clear many Edgewater doctors were complacent in Peter Rogan's money-making scheme. One doctor admitted, quote, "You gotta learn how to make money off these people." And by the mid-1990s, people were calling the hospital a butcher shop, and the new motto was profits over patients. Other doctors were concerned about the malpractice of their coworkers and brought incident reports to Roger Ehmen. But Roger dismissed their claims and was like, "Look, they make us too much money. I'm not going to make them mad." It was rather pretty common for doctors who voiced their concerns to be fired, just like Dr. G. One of the ways the hospital tried to hide their unnecessary admissions of patients was through the use of pretty much false contracts. Roger Ehmen would draw up teaching contracts for the doctors, paying them $10,000 a month. These contracts claimed they were for teaching or for reading AKGs, but in reality, their sole purpose was to admit more patients. And one of these doctors these held true for included a man named Dr. Seshagiri Rao Vavilekulu, who went by the name Dr. Rao. Dr. Rao was an anesthesiologist at Edgewater, and his contract was simply a way for the hospital to pay him for admitting patients into the hospital. And not only were these doctors feeling the need to admit several patients, but Roger Ehmen was also under constant pressure to increase the number of patients at Edgewater by Peter. Whenever numbers were down, Roger would call in the heavy hitters, i.e. the doctors who performed surgeries or other medical procedures, a process that they called dialing for dollars. Many doctors who were not part of this scheme were becoming more and more suspicious, as countless healthy patients were admitted to Edgewater daily. And whenever they reported their concerns to their supervisors, they were either given vague answers, were outright dismissed, or told not to cause problems. Dr. Rao was all for the scheme, though. He actually called Roger Ehmen daily with the number of patients he was in fact admitting. In fact, during an in-person meeting, Roger offered Rao $15,000 if he was able to admit 20 to 30 patients a month. This is when Roger explained Edgewater's patients for kickback scheme, an elaborate plan to fraudulently collect money from patients' Medicare. So here's how it worked. Edgewater sent out 3 bills to patients, but never seriously attempted to collect the money. The hospital then wrote off Medicare's 20% deductible as bad debt and told the patients to throw the remainder of their bills in the trash. Now, in doing this, as long as the auditors saw that the hospital tried to collect the deductible, they didn't find an issue and they'd pay out the money. This is the reason so many patients agreed to be treated at Edgewater, especially those who didn't have much money, because they didn't have to pay. Little did they know, though, the FBI was onto them about this scheme. The FBI had hired somebody named Dr. Monty McClelland to go undercover and feed them information from inside Edgewater. McClelland was a perfect fit because he had previously been convicted of accepting kickbacks and improperly admitting hundreds of patients to another Chicago hospital. And so his reputation for bending the rules was useful, as he was easily able to pose as an eager doctor ready to join the scheme at Edgewater. So the FBI gave McClelland a recording device and sent him off to the hospital to get some information. Upon arrival at the hospital, McClelland met with Dr. Rao, and during their secretly recorded meeting, McClelland said that he had some healthy patients that could be admitted into the hospital. And surprise, surprise, Rao agreed and suggested paying the patients or offering checkups if they needed further enticing to come to the hospital. Not only this, but he then offered McClelland $100 for every patient admitted into the hospital. But little did Rao know, the patients McClelland brought to the hospital were undercover wired FBI agents. This scheme worked for them for quite a while, but it began to fall in 1998 when insurance companies just started outright denying payments to many of Rao's patients, and in turn, the hospital began losing money. Since many of Rao's patients were perfectly healthy, they would straight up tell attending physicians, look, I don't know why I'm here, or another doctor told me to say I have chest pains. So to fix this problem, Roger Ehmen began telling Rao that he needed to better coach his patients so that they wouldn't admit to other doctors that they were perfectly fine and were being told to pretend that they weren't. But after some time, Peter Rogan found that Dr. Rao began acting very suspiciously around the hospital, and because of this, he soon fired Rao for his odd behavior and for failing the kickback scheme. Peter said he smelled a rat and was under the impression that Rao was turning on the idea of the kickback scheme, which was most definitely true because Rao did in fact have plans to not only stop partaking in the scheme, but to catch Peter admitting to the act. Weeks after being fired, Rao requested to meet with Peter to chat. But what Peter didn't know was that at this meeting, Rao was wearing a wire, hoping to incriminate his previous boss. Unfortunately, though, Peter no longer trusted Rao, and throughout the entire meeting, he managed to say all the right things to avoid saying something that could have possibly incriminated him. While the change in mind of Rao was a loss for Peter, Roger and their schemes didn't stop the fact that they still had a team of doctors ready, willing, and able to partake in their fraud. And one of these doctors included in the schemes was cardiologist Dr. Andrew Cubria. Andrew Cubria was born in Cuba, and at 10 years old, he was one of the thousands of unaccompanied children airlifted to Miami as part of the covert mission known as Operation Petal Palmer. Petal Palmer was an agreement of cooperation between the U.S. State Department and Catholic Charities of Miami. It started after Fidel Castro rose to power and was initially intended for children whose parents were fighting against him underground, but shortly expanded to all Cuban families who wanted to flee out of fear for their future under the new regime. From December 1960 through the end of 1962, more than 14,000 unaccompanied children aging from 4 to 16 years old were sent by their parents from Cuba to Miami. Most children stayed with family members living in the U.S. until their parents arrived to Cuba. However, those who didn't have any family in the States were instead left to stay in orphanages run by the Catholic Church. From there, they were placed in foster families in Miami and throughout the U.S. Cubria grew up steps away from Edgewater Hospital, and he always dreamed of working there when older. So it was quite the dream come true when Dr. Mazel hired him as the head cardiologist in 1962. Dr. Cubria was known for looking like what was described as a slob around the hospital. For example, he'd often wear stained sweatshirts instead of the traditional button-down shirt. Not only this, but he was also known for being a drill sergeant-like person. He constantly yelled at everyone, and he just had this large ego and God complex about him, like he was the greatest thing the hospital could have ever produced. Other doctors literally called him the heartless heart doctor and the cardiologist without a stethoscope because he was never seen wearing a stethoscope or doing any real tests on patients. But the worst of it all, he was also known for doing unnecessary treatments on patients. One of his favorite unnecessary treatments to do included a cardiac catheterization. This is a test or treatment for certain heart or blood vessel problems like clogged arteries or irregular heartbeats. It essentially uses a thin hollow tube called a catheter to insert into one's groin, neck, or arm and guide through a blood vessel to get to the heart. Cubria was just such an aggressive person, though. If patients refused treatment from him, he would just straight up yell at them saying, "Do you want to die?" Just pretty much pressuring them into agreeing to these procedures, which is wild because in the 1950s to 60s, Edgewater was actually one of the leading medical institutes for heart health. I mean, like mentioned, they were known for creating a blood clot drug, a type of open heart surgery, and they even created the first coronary care unit, which is a dedicated ambulance for patients having a heart attack. During this time, if anyone had heart issues, this was the place to be. However, by the 1990s, Dr. Cubria, who was a cardiologist and not a specialist, was authorizing countless unnecessary cardiac catheterizations and other procedures. In fact, there were 2 patients of Dr. Cubria who actually passed away after being pressured into receiving unnecessary heart procedures by him. One was an unnamed woman from Chicago, and the other was a man named Albert Okaro. And they both suffered heart attacks after undergoing an angiogram and angioplasty. In April 2000, a 42-year-old auto mechanic, Albert Okaro, went to Edgewater to get some shoulder pain checked out. He was seen by Dr. Cubria, who told him he needed to rule out any heart issues and convinced Albert he needed to get an angiogram and have an angioplasty conducted. For reference, an angiogram is a test which uses x-rays to find blockages in the arteries, and an angioplasty is a procedure which uses a balloon-like device to widen a blocked artery. These are very invasive heart procedures, yet Dr. Cubria insisted Albert needed to have these done despite his complaints about shoulder pain and not anything really relating to the heart. Eventually, Albert agreed to go through with this procedure. However, during the angioplasty, Dr. Cubria ended up causing a literal dissection of the coronary artery. And it wasn't too long after when Albert went through cardiac arrest and passed away. When the hospital's risk manager investigated the incident, which was just about 20 to 30 minutes after Albert passed away, she found that the film documenting Albert's procedure was missing. And this was because after Albert passed away, Dr. Cubria tried getting rid of any evidence revealing that Albert didn't need these procedures. But little did Dr. Cubria know, a lab tech had actually saved a copy of the film, and they later sent this over to the FBI. Albert was in the hospital for less than 24 hours before Dr. Cubria performed this unnecessary cardiac catheterization that caused him to pass away. And to top it all off, his insurance company was billed $30,000 for the procedure. Interestingly enough, despite the unnecessary procedures, some coworkers claimed that Cubria was actually a good doctor, but they were saying that he did all of this because he fell on hard times and needed some extra money. It was said that for a while, Cubria constantly fought with Roger Ehmen and Peter Rogan as they were threatening to pull his patients from Edgewater. However, since he then started bringing in so many patients, he then had incredible leverage over his supervisors, which allowed him to operate with free range. Now, an undercover FBI agent had actually eventually met with Cubria, and during their recorded conversation, Cubria had explained the cardiac catheterization procedure in great detail to them. So, this showed that he knew what the procedure was, the severity of the procedure, and when it should be prescribed, and that he knew that what he was doing was causing great harm to people for absolutely no reason. Later in the investigation, a government-hired expert reviewing Dr. Cubria's procedures reported that, quote, Dr. Cubria is endangering the lives of patients under his care. The continued practice of medicine by Dr. Cubria presents an immediate danger to the safety of the public. But that's not all. The FBI was also investigating another Edgewater physician, Dr. Krishna Swami Suram, who went by Dr. Kris. Dr. Kris had a private practice at Edgewater, but he also saw patients through the hospital, and he was billing the government for seemingly impossible records. According to Dr. Kris's billing records, in just one day, he saw 187 patients while making 131 house calls, and all of these patients just so happened to have congestive heart failure. He documented that he worked more than 24 hours on 150 different occasions. In January 1999, there was a severe snowstorm in Chicago, which brought the city to a standstill. However, despite the hazardous weather conditions, Dr. Kris was apparently able to visit 31 elderly patients at their home and 18 more in medical facilities. He also claimed to have treated 32 patients who were actually deceased, and his records indicate that he met with patients every single day in 1997 and 1998, while missing only 2 days of work in 1999. Another thing that was said in the podcast or that I read somewhere was that he once had a reported day where he worked for 25 hours. Some of the elderly patients of Dr. Kris began growing suspicious after they noticed that they had overinflated billings on their explanation of benefit forms, and at least 15 of his patients had contacted the Wisconsin Physician Service, which is a service that handles claims in the Illinois area. The Wisconsin Physician Service alerted the FBI, and they immediately began an investigation. And Edgewater's schemes soon began to fall apart. Around this time, the FBI charged the hospital with an upcoding scheme. Though they didn't admit any wrongdoing, they had to pay out over $1 million to avoid a federal lawsuit. And they must have felt like they were safe because amidst the federal investigation on May 27, 1999, they were actually approved to purchase another hospital. Edgewater ended up purchasing Grant Hospital, which was another struggling Chicago hospital, for $17.5 million. However, despite being approved to do this, they weren't safe. Multiple doctors who were working at Edgewater began working with the FBI. And hundreds of conversations were recorded, which the FBI used to flip more doctors, with the ultimate goal of catching the man who was the head of all of it, Peter Rogan. Peter Rogan was actually somewhat weary that the FBI was doing an investigation. He just had this feeling that they were onto him, and so he began to speak and act with extreme caution. He would communicate with his fraud team by writing notes in a special notepad that he kept with him at all times. He would speak in codes, and he would make sure to deny anything related to the hospital's illegal schemes. It eventually got to a point he was paranoid not just of the normal staff at Edgewater, but he was paranoid of the staff who were in on the schemes with him. There was one instance in particular. Peter invited Roger Ehmen to a business meeting at the Ritz-Carlton, and after this meeting, he insisted that Roger join him for a steam bath at the Ritz's club. But this wasn't just to hang out with his friend and right-hand man, but this was actually so that Peter could check to see if Roger was wearing a wire or not, so that he'd be able to speak privately and candidly about the hospital's operations. Even during the steam bath, Peter kept pouring water over the hot coals because doing this created a hissing sound, and he wanted this to happen to make sure their voices would be muffled just in case a wire or a recording device was present. During this meeting, Peter then began to tell Roger about an interesting novel he had read. In this novel, there just happened to be a man who was in a tough situation and things weren't looking too good for them. But he ended up rising to the occasion and acted in the best interests of the organization that he worked for, took full responsibility for everything that was done wrong, and in the end, everything turned out well for him. However, this novel didn't even exist, and this was rather Peter's attempt to put the bug in the ear and make Roger take responsibility for the wrongdoings of the hospital if push came to shove. After he explained this story, he then very explicitly told Roger that if he avoided implicating him, that he would ensure Roger's family was well taken care of, even if Roger ended up in prison. He even promised to hire Roger's wife to work for his management company. Following this encounter, during any conversation Peter was having with Roger, Peter would speak aloud about mundane, day-to-day topics, but simultaneously write messages on a notepad about how things didn't look good, how he couldn't support Roger's family any longer because it would look inappropriate, look like he's paying him off, and how he could take care of Roger forever. And Peter Rogan continued to grow more and more paranoid. He always thought he was being recorded. One time he even met up with Dr. Cubria and advised him to lawyer up, saying he was under investigation. He even wrote on the notepad to destroy your computer and any memos you've written, and do not tell your attorney about this conversation. However, Dr. Cubria didn't have the means to lawyer up, and a few weeks later, during a private meeting at a restaurant, he straight up told Peter, "Look, I'm broke. I can't afford a criminal defense lawyer. If anything happens, I'm going to need to use a public defender." And so because of this, a few days later, Peter told Cubria to meet with a man named Dr. Lopez. And it was at this meeting when Dr. Lopez handed Cubria with an envelope containing $9,000 cash. By that point, it wasn't just Peter and the staff who knew about the investigations, but the public knew as well. News outlets began publishing articles describing the investigations occurring at the hospital. Many staff feared for their jobs. It was clear that the mortality of Edgewater executives was gone. No one investigated the passings of Dr. Cubria's patients. Doctors and maintenance workers were asked to falsify records. Edgewater was subject to plenty of oversight by several different agencies, including the Illinois Public Department of Health. They even paid the Joint Commission $40,000 every 3 years to conduct a survey. The Joint Commission is an independent, not-for-profit organization, and it's the nation's largest and oldest standard-setting and accrediting body in healthcare. To earn and maintain the gold seal of approval from the Joint Commission, an organization undergoes an on-site survey by a Joint Commission survey team at least every 3 years. A passing grade from this survey would indicate that the hospital was clean, adequately staffed, and provided superior care to its patients. However, during the 1990s, the Joint Commission accreditation standards were extremely lenient. They didn't actually check if nurses and doctors were licensed, and they gave notice of their inspections up to 3 months in advance. But approval from the Joint Commission was crucial for Edgewater as it allowed them to treat Medicare patients, and they seemed to receive it every time. A governing board at Edgewater was also responsible for oversight. However, each member on this board just so happened to be a friend of Peter's and pretty much would just go along with anything he said. Anyway, because it started becoming painfully clear that they were going to be caught, Peter quickly called a meeting with Roger. And during this meeting, he wrote him a note saying that it's time for him to, quote, do your job, take responsibility for everything, say that you did all of the activities described on the tapes without my knowledge, and that the best thing for him to do is to plead guilty and cooperate, take the blame for everything. When allegations began to arise in the news, the governing board at Edgewater fired Peter's management company, and just the next day, the U.S. Attorney's Office dropped a 58-count indictment, including Dr. Rao, Peter's management company, and Roger Ehmen, charging them with a bribery scheme that targeted elderly, frail people and people struggling with homelessness and substance abuse. The indictment alleged that Medicare, Medicaid, and private companies paid over $1 million for unneeded medical care performed by Edgewater doctors. And guess what? Peter Rogan was not charged. In 2001, Roger Ehmen entered a guilty plea for his role in the Patients for Kickbacks scheme, where he admitted to funneling $290,000 in kickbacks to 2 doctors. In later interviews, Roger said that he only took the guilty plea so that he would receive a lower sentence, but he said that he never did anything wrong. He just signed documents, and his lawyer argued that everything he did was under the order of Peter Rogan. On the other hand, the prosecutors explained that Roger and Peter worked hand in hand and said that Roger was the one recruiting doctors, instructing doctors to bring in more patients, and ordering administrators to falsify and backdate contracts, pretty much making him a leader or organizer of these schemes. Roger was ultimately sentenced to 78 months or 6.5 years in prison, 3 years of probation, and he was ordered to pay $5 million in restitution. After his sentencing, rumors began to spread that Roger was being paid an astronomical amount of money for taking the fall. However, no evidence was found to support these rumors, though it wouldn't be surprising considering how rich Peter was if he was giving him a little something to take the blame. At that point, Edgewater was struggling so badly financially, and when Medicare and Medicaid removed their financial payments and reimbursements in November 2001, since fraud was no longer an option, the hospital was forced to close. As a result, 666 people lost their jobs and an entire community lost a hospital. And the hospital officially closed its doors on December 6, 2001. When they closed down, many people were devastated. Many people were in shock. Others weren't surprised, and those who had been trying to sound the alarm for years were relieved. After the hospital officially closed, the FBI spent weeks combing through every room of Edgewater, just looking for documents and just other forms of evidence. There was just this eerie and unnerving silence in the empty hospital. It seemed almost as if everyone just up and left one day. There were still lunches in the staff room, fridges, while some of the office furniture was sold in a bankruptcy auction. Most of it remained. Jars of specimens lined the shelves, and boxes of prescription drugs were scattered. Just a mess. The son of Dr. Manulet remarked that, quote, "The hospital wasn't even given the dignity of a respectful death. It's like a loved one died in the streets and everyone just let it rot there." And during their search, several former patients were coming into the hospital just begging to see their doctors. The FBI began searching for Peter Rogan's money, which he stored in countless offshore accounts across the globe. Investigators believed that Peter's friend and lawyer Fred Cuppy and his accountant David Miller set up various trusts in Peter's children's names to hide his money from creditors. When the court ordered David Miller to turn over financial records, he told them Fred Cuppy has everything. And 2 weeks later, David was found not alive in his home, and it was ruled that he took his life from hanging, leaving behind a wife and 4 children. Soon after, Dr. Cubria admitted that he was a part of the scheme at Edgewater for profit, and in February 2002, he pleaded guilty to performing over 750 invasive and unnecessary heart procedures on patients. Shortly later, in June 2002, Cubria was sentenced to 12 and a half years of federal prison. He was ordered to forfeit $2 million in profits, and he was ordered to pay an additional $14.4 million in restitution. The thing is, remember how Cubria was worried he wouldn't be able to afford a lawyer because he was growing broke? Well, since his medical license was suspended after this investigation, he was actually unemployed at the time and was living in a basement. And he genuinely did not have the funds to pay for any of these fines. Furthermore, Cubria also settled his malpractice case with the Okaro family. After 4.5 years of courtroom drama, on October 20th, 2004, a judge ruled for the Okaro estate to win or to be awarded just over $9 million. And the list of doctors being sentenced continued to grow. Dr. Rao pled guilty, admitting to unnecessarily hospitalizing 900 patients at Edgewater. He was sentenced to 35 months in prison and was ordered to pay over $5 million in restitution. A doctor named Kumar Kalyana admitted to receiving kickbacks in return for admitting patients to Edgewater. He was sentenced to 16 months in prison and was ordered to pay $1.15 million in restitution. Dr. Barnabas admitted to funneling kickback payments to both Drs. Rao and Kalyana in exchange for admitting patients to Edgewater. He was sentenced to 52 months in prison and was ordered to pay $100,000 in restitution. On January 10th, 2002, the government charged Dr. Kris, claiming that he fraudulently obtained at least $1.2 million in Medicare payments. His lawyer's defense was that he was simply a bad bookkeeper and claimed that the government had cherry-picked data when dealing with his case. However, through the investigation, the government found that, like Dr. Cubria, Dr. Kris was also performing unnecessary procedures such as cardiac catheterizations. Also, he was performing aortograms and arteriograms, and he was labeled by experts as a mortal threat. And on September 29th, 2002, he pled guilty to mail fraud, healthcare fraud, and tax fraud in a plea agreement, admitting to obtaining all of the Medicare payments, however, standing in position that the government did not have sufficient evidence to back up the unnecessary procedures claims. In court, he sobbed, saying, "I apologize to everyone that I've offended for my foolishness." With this plea agreement, there was a maximum sentencing of 18 years and a maximum fine of $750. However, Dr. Kris was rather sentenced to 5 years of probation plus restitution of $1,000, $258. Braddock Management and Bainbridge Management, the management companies that ran the hospital from the 1990s to 2001 and were largely owned and operated by Peter Rogan, also pleaded guilty to criminal healthcare fraud charges. A federal judge ordered them to pay $13.6 million each. However, that number was dropped to $2.6 million due to their inability to pay. And the wildest part was during in the trials, while these trials were taking place, Peter Rogan remained a free man. In 2004, the government dropped its criminal charges against Peter, and instead of criminal charges, the government and the hospital's former creditors, Dexia Bank, filed civil suits against him. The civil suit was noteworthy because it was the first healthcare suit ever to go on trial in Northern Illinois, as these types of cases are usually settled before they make it to the courtroom. And Peter continued to maintain his innocence. He had no plans to agree to a settlement. He was just so confident and believed his legal team could win the case, and he was hoping that a jury would be the one deciding his fate, as he thought he would be definitely safe having them on his side. The United States versus Peter Rogan finally went to trial in the spring of 2006. In the civil case, the government alleged that Peter cheated government insurers in an elaborate fraud scheme. In a civil case, 51% of the evidence must favor the plaintiff or the government for there to be a guilty verdict. And with these allegations, tens of millions of Peter's dollars were at stake. Interestingly enough, his lawyers argued that there was a conspiracy at the hospital and fraud was committed, but Peter Rogan was not involved, and they subsequently placed all the blame on Roger Ehmen. Peter's bench trial went on for weeks, and Roger was essentially the government's star witness. His testimony was so important because it would be the main thing disproving Peter's defense that he didn't know about the fraud happening at Edgewater. When called to testify, Roger was already in prison serving out his sentence for his role in the hospital schemes. However, he answered questions for 3 days on the witness stand. A bench trial, by the way, is a trial without a jury in which a judge decides the facts. In a jury trial, the jury decides the facts, and defendants will occasionally waive the right to a jury trial and choose to have a bench trial if preferred. However, Peter did not do this, so unfortunately for him, he had to deal with a non-jury trial during his trial. Peter's lawyers attacked Roger's credibility and accused him of remembering new details when the FBI questioned him years later. Roger even ended up taking 2 polygraph tests in which both showed that some of his answers were indicative of deceit. This, of course, though, can't 100% accurately pinpoint whether someone is lying or not, so might not even be all that significant. Peter's lawyers also asked Roger if he was contemplating taking his life around the time of the steam bath incident, but Roger denied it. Dr. Cubria was another star witness for the government. Like Roger, he was also incarcerated at the time, and he described how Roger never did anything without talking to Peter first. He further went on to explain the note passing incident where Peter told him to clear his computer and said how he always went to Peter whenever he needed money, and that Peter was in fact constantly funneling money to him via funds for his commercials, loans, and contracts to ensure patient referrals. After both Roger and Cubria's testimony, Peter was next, and the judge had to decide who was more credible, 2 men currently in prison or Peter. And Peter, unsurprisingly, was very evasive on the stand. He offered up pretty much no information, and he only answered questions that were worded as perfectly as possible. He claimed how Roger was entirely responsible for recruiting physicians, signing physicians to contracts, and determining client compliance and compensation. And he denied engaging in any sort of questionable discussions or behaviors. He continued to accuse Roger of questioning taking his own life during the time of the FBI investigation into the hospital, and claimed that taking him to the steam bath was his attempt to try to comfort Roger, telling him, quote, that would be a cowardly way to address this issue. He further went on to deny instructing Cubria to destroy his computer, but this claim was quite iffy because they found that Peter had ordered a document destruction company to destroy 20 boxes of files from his office after he received a subpoena from the grand jury. Peter was then questioned about why he sold the hospital and continued to receive millions through his management company that ran the hospital. Because between 1995 and 2000, he pocketed over $9.5 million from distributions coming from the management company. So things overall weren't looking too great for Peter. There was just stacks of evidence against him, and he would have quite literally needed a miracle for the judge to even think he was innocent. And in the fall of 2006, the judge finally reached a verdict. The ruling stated that Peter, quote, knowingly and for the purpose of obtaining reimbursement from the government, caused Edgewater to submit numerous false claims. Rogan took a very hands-on approach concerning revenue. He created codes to track physician referrals and changed the codes to disguise their purpose. Determining how many patients Cubria and others were referring to Edgewater was essential to Rogan's scheme. This was done regularly to determine if he was getting his money's worth from the payments the hospital was making to Rao. Rogan also went to great lengths to hide his equitable ownership from the onset of his scheme up to the time of his trial. Rogan created a maze of entities and transactions to acquire and operate Edgewater. He provided false statements to accounting firms regarding his ownership while CEO and testified falsely at trial in this regard. And with this verdict, the judge ordered Peter to pay damages and penalties just over $64 million. Less than 2 weeks had gone by with Peter receiving this verdict when he fired his lawyers and straight up fled the country. He left the States as quickly as he could to hide out, living in Vancouver, Canada. Since he was now living as a fugitive in Vancouver, Canada, he actually missed his son's wedding in September 2007. But what's wild is that the FBI actually crashed his son's wedding, and it was there they served Peter's friend, Fred Cuppy, with a citation to discover assets. This citation required the person being served to appear in court and answer questions about their property and income, especially after Peter's accountant, David, said that Fred had everything. Peter had entered Canada as a visitor in 2006, and he shortly applied for his permanent Canadian citizenship. Since he was never charged criminally, there was nothing Canadian authorities could do to deny him residency. Back in the US, the FBI visited Peter's old business office in Northwest Indiana, which they found abandoned, and they also found an invoice from a document destruction company Peter used to destroy 47 boxes of documents weeks before he fled the country. When he fled, he avoided another lawsuit filed by Edgewater's former creditor company, Dexia Bank. The lawsuit claimed that Peter fraudulently induced Dexia into agreeing to a line of credit by lying about the income of the hospital. When doing their investigation, Peter made it extremely difficult for Dexia's lawyers to obtain any evidence. And one day, he just flat out stopped defending himself, forcing the court to enter a default judgment and ordering Peter to pay Dexia $126 million. They needed to get this money from Peter, so a team of creditors, accountants, and computer experts went searching for his money. Through this search, they found tens of millions of dollars stashed across the world. Since Peter now owed the government and Dexia over $180 million, and Peter was off hiding, the FBI went after Peter's physical assets. Collecting these assets, however, was extremely difficult because something that Peter did, assumingly in preparation for a situation like this, was that he put his assets in other people's names, meaning that the lawyers had to convince the court that they belonged to Peter in order for them to be able to use it. One asset, for example, was the Rogan home in Indiana, which was in Peter's wife's name, Judy. When Judy tried to sell the home, Dexia's lawyers put a lien on the $1.6 million sale. A lien on a house means there's a public record of legal claim placed against the property because of an unpaid debt, such as utilities or taxes. This makes the homeowner unable to sell the property, and lenders will not approve a mortgage for a potential buyer until the lien is lifted. Shortly after this, Judy then purchased a brand new luxury condo in downtown Chicago with $1 million cash. In court, however, Dexia's lawyers argued that even though the condo was in Judy's name, it was paid for with Peter's money and therefore belonged to Peter. Two of Peter's children testified, saying that they lived at the condo but didn't pay rent and weren't sure who owned the condo. They also claimed they didn't know who the landlord was. Soon after, Judy Rogan filed for bankruptcy, but this was merely a stall tactic. Eventually, though, Dexia was able to get the condo and they subsequently sold it. Dexia then went after the trust Peter put in his children's name. Their lawyers claimed that the trusts were simply a way to hide money from creditors and the money was generated via the healthcare fraud scheme. The children tried to claim that they were innocent of any wrongdoing and should be allowed to keep their money. And litigation over this money went on for months. However, the court ultimately decided that this was in fact Peter's money and that all but $30,000 had to be turned over. Now, again, one of Peter's accountants in the Bahamas held over $30 million, but in an affidavit, Peter denied having access to it. An affidavit, by the way, is a written statement of facts confirmed by the oath of the party making it. These must be notarized or administered by an officer of the court with such authority. So, he denied having access. However, investigators soon learned that Peter actually made over $8 million worth of distributions through his account to himself and others. Payments went to Peter's wife and personal expenses like his yacht. The yacht was in the name of a company called BFB, or Big Effing Boat Inc. And so the feds eventually seized the yacht and sold it. So the FBI was out here taking condos from his wife, trusts from his children, yachts. All the while, Peter was out there living in a stunning penthouse in downtown Vancouver, paying $5,000 a month in rent and just absolutely chilling. In fact, he went on several vacations outside of Canada during that time. He just made sure to be careful and avoid the US. But anyway, this little hideout for him was definitely not forever. He lived there for a year and a half before authorities discovered a plan that would finally get him caught. Canadian authorities told the lawyers in Chicago that a charge of perjury or obstruction of justice would make Peter inadmissible in Canada. So, a few days later, U.S. officials filed charges of perjury in trying to obstruct the government's efforts to collect the tens of millions, hundreds even, of dollars that Peter owed. It was finally in May 2008 when Peter and his wife were on a flight home from China when they were met by Canadian Border Service officers. Peter was immediately arrested and taken into custody, and after his arrest, Peter hired a Canadian immigration lawyer to fight his extradition to the US. While he did eventually post bond and was released, he was posed as a flight risk and his passport was finally confiscated this time. For the next 7 years, Peter's hearings would drag on, and back in the US, Fred Cuppy was continuing to create issues for the government Indexia lawyers. At one point, Fred sent an email to the bank saying, quote, "It would be helpful if you could tell Neil Hallman," which was Peter's lawyer at the time, "that no documents will be sent to anyone and no information will be given out about the matter that will allow him to disclose that he is unable to get any information about the trust." Fred instructed these parties to withhold documents to further the lie that Peter lacked access to his offshore accounts. But while trying to take up for his friend, Peter, Fred was just digging a hole for himself. He was soon indicted on several charges, but eventually pled guilty to one count of perjury for making a false statement to the court about Peter's assets. He was sentenced to 366 days or 1 year and 1 day in prison, and he had to pay a $4,000 fine. Now, as this was all going on, Edgewater Hospital was still sitting there empty and abandoned. Frequent flooding made the hospital mold, and it was rat infested, and it was quite unsafe to walk through and just walk around. Those who lived in the community essentially watched as the building crumbled away. However, Peter's property company was holding up redevelopment of the hospital, as this company owned the deeds to 4 of the hospital's buildings. But like most assets associated with Peter, the bankruptcy court ultimately ordered those deeds to be turned over, and Peter was ordered to pay $5 million in damages to the now bankrupt hospital. They placed scaffolding and tarp over the building as it sat and rotted for 20 years. And during those many years of it just sitting there, many people broke into the hospital for a variety of different reasons. Some people were there to take things like copper wire and other materials they deemed useful. Criminals were also using it as a spot to do drug deals and whatnot. And urban explorers broke in and photographed the abandoned building. The first to do this ended up posting the photos they took online, and this just attracted more photographers and explorers to break inside the building. Urban exploration is considered trespassing, and it does come with some serious dangers. The buildings are often derelict, unstable, and infested with harmful chemicals, waste, bacteria, mold, asbestos, animals, and what have you. But some urban explorers went to extreme lengths to gain access to the hospital. One person climbed the scaffold onto the roof and shimmied into an open window. One person simply replaced one of the padlocks with one of their own so that they could come and go as they pleased. This was until the door got welded shut and they weren't able to do this anymore. The basement was the most common point of entry, but it was constantly flooded, meaning that these explorers would have to wait for it to freeze just to be able to walk across. Or they would have to wear waders to walk through the dirty water. Explorers were just drawn to the architecture of the building, the soft colors, the elaborate paintings and tiles, the way the light came in. And some really just liked the various states of decay or just the interesting history of the hospital, which was very unusual for the north side of Chicago. The hyperbaric chamber was located on the hospital's third floor, and not only was it a cruel reminder of the once state-of-the-art facility the hospital used to be, but it was a dangerous thing to be around. Because once inside, it could snap shut and lock someone in it at any moment. However, it would eventually be removed in February 2019. The golden rule among urban explorers was to take only pictures, leave only footprints. Explorers never took anything from the hospital. They were just there to see the scenery and get the pictures. It seems it was almost like a museum to them. However, when a developer eventually purchased the hospital campus, this put an end to the adventures of the Edgewater urban explorers. One urban explorer even explained how they made 150 trips into the building, and at some point they began talking to their therapist because it consumed their mind, and even their family was concerned. It was becoming a problem how often they thought about the hospital, so when the place was officially gone, this helped them get more stable and feel more serene. There was one instance 2 15-year-olds even broke into the building to go rooftoping, though their adventure was unfortunately unsuccessful because a transformer exploded and they both were critically injured. Thousands of medical records with people's sensitive information, including social security numbers, credit card numbers, birth dates, many things were also left behind. However, after a Chicago news station reported on this issue, police showed up to remove the files a few days later. Some years later, in 2014, those in the community went to their local alderman, Patrick O'Connor, and demanded that the hospital be torn down. In Chicago, an alderman is a person who is elected by the residents of a geographic area, known as a ward, to represent them as a member of the city council. However, Patrick had no plans on getting rid of that building. Instead, they redeveloped the area surrounding the hospital. And in early 2015, the hospital's parking garage was leveled, and soon after, the buildings were also demolished. 27 single-family homes and 155 apartments were built on the hospital's former parking lots. And what's very interesting is that the realtor who sold these homes on this property just so happened to be Patrick's wife, Barbara O'Connor. And Barbara just so happened to make millions of dollars in profit from doing this. Although this scheme was frowned upon by residents, it was perfectly legal in Chicago. It's just wild no matter what or who. There just always seems to be some kind of scheme going on at this hospital. But it was shortly after this when the actual main schemer of the hospital was taken care of. On June 18, 2015, after nearly a decade of fighting his extradition back to the United States, Peter Rogan surrendered, dropping his case to remain in Canada and unexpectedly returning to the United States. Peter was charged with perjury and obstruction of justice and was faced with up to 50 years in prison and a $1 million fine. He entered a not guilty plea, was denied bond, and was declared a flight risk, so he remained at Chicago's Metropolitan Prison while awaiting trial. He told authorities that since 2006, he had no assets and his income was limited to $800 a month from Social Security. However, this was a blatant lie since he was paying $5,000 a month for rent in Vancouver. His wife, Judy, also claimed that she had no source of income other than Social Security. Authorities eventually found out that Peter's rent checks came from his sister. However, she was a retired school teacher who also claimed to live off Social Security and her pension. So it made no sense she was able to wire nearly $500,000 to pay Peter's rent, attorneys, wife, and children. And his name was listed on the account, and the check was linked to one of his old business places. So this was clearly one of Peter's place assets in another person's name plan. He tried to hide the fact that he was laundering money through his sister. Ultimately, in September 2015, Peter Rogan pled guilty to perjury for lying in an affidavit denying that he controlled millions of dollars in a trust account in the Bahamas. With this plea agreement, he admitted to creating a secret letter of wishes spelling out his intentions for the money and the fact that he had asked his friend and lawyer, Fred Cuppy, to distribute all of his money and assets in an attempt to hide them from being collected. In court, multiple victim impact statements were read. One was read by Albert Okaro's attorney, and there was also a victim impact statement from Dexia. Dexia described the lengths they had to go through just to collect scrapings of what Peter owed them. Throughout the trial, they attended 181 hearings, went through 10 different judges, and had to search 3 countries to collect the money that he owed. The government was able to recover $6.7 million from Peter while he was out hiding, and Dexia was able to recover $20 million. However, he owed them $124 million, and it cost them $9 million in efforts just to be able to get that. So they only got a profit of $11 million. So as part of his plea, he was ordered to comply with all outstanding court orders, including the over $188 million he needed to pay out. Because by that point in 2015, all of the money that the government in Dexia collected was money they sought out and searched for. He didn't willingly pay a penny to anyone. In court, his lawyers tried shifting focus from the victim impact statement. He was expressing how a now 69-year-old Peter was remorseful. He had a non-existent criminal history, and said how he was villainized by the press and by civil lawsuits. They had his children speak out about his character and how he was just trying to be a provider for them. There was even a young doctor who was friends with Peter's son who described how Peter was the father he never had, and that it was through his help employing him at Edgewater he was able to start his career. But the Dexia lawyers weren't having that, and they called him out. They claimed that all Peter cared about was his money. It didn't matter what he needed to do or who he needed to step over. He was going to do whatever he needed to obtain his money and protect it. There were 6 lawyers for Dexia in the court, and it was notable that one of them in particular, Andrew Voutros, was speaking for them because this was going to be the last trial he ever did, and it just so happened to be the biggest one of his career. He wanted Peter to get the maximum sentence, but Peter's lawyers rather argued that government, and especially Dexia, was being vindictive and that he didn't like the energy in the courtroom because they can't base the law on vindictiveness. He told the judge how Peter fully learned from his mistakes and requested that he'd be given a prison sentence of 1 year, 1 day. On October 14th, 2015, Peter Rogan was sentenced to 21 months in prison. Many were confused on why his sentencing was so low considering the maximum amount he was facing was 50 years. Several people were saying that a 21-month sentencing was a slap on the wrist considering all he did, and wondered how such a sentencing was decided. After he pled guilty to perjury, his obstruction of justice charge was dropped. So the maximum amount of prison time he was facing ultimately dropped as well to 21 months. Peter Rogan was never charged in the hospital's fraud scheme. He was never charged for fleeing and obstructing justice. All he got were charges for perjury. He was eventually released from prison on December 8th, 2016, where he was then placed on supervised release for 3 years. This meant that if he wanted to travel out the area, he needed permission from the court or probation officer. He officially retired, and he and his wife Judy were said to have moved in with his son and his family in Northwest Indiana. This, by the way, was the son whose wedding he skipped while hiding out in Vancouver. Now, for an update on the rest of them, out of all the doctors sentenced, one is currently retired, one is deceased, and the rest are still practicing medicine. As for Roger, the podcast hosts were actually able to find and get him for an interview. He said that he was remorseful and that he'd live with the guilt of what he did for the rest of his life, but that he's now a different man. Overall, employees seemed to like Roger. He was described by many as nice, and there was a rumor that the reason he took all the blame was that there was a $2 million bank account waiting for him following his release. But I don't know, that was just a rumor, not confirmed. But while in prison, he reflected on his life, led a Bible study group, and was said by the minister to have left an impact on the other inmates like he's never seen before. After his release in 2007, Roger interviewed and got hired to work with nonprofit Westside Health Authority. According to its website, this is an organization that helps neighbors and families build a better community. With this job, he wanted to help those who were less fortunate or struggling. More specifically, he wanted to help ex-cons to be able to re-enter the workforce. And he did just that. He helped several clients find a job, which honestly is kind of a full circle moment from the people that lost their job from Edgewater closing. He said that he still kept in touch with former colleagues, only having 1 or 2 encounters with former employees that were bad ones. For example, he recalled one time he was in the grocery store and someone yelled from a distance, "You cost me my job," which fair enough, people 100% have the right to be angry at what he did, because regardless, who's to blame? He said himself, he's a grown man and there were things that he could have not done but still did. Roger said that he regrets things that he did, saying that overall lots of employees respected and liked him, and he even expressed, quote, "I believe if I had a different CEO at the hospital than the one that we had, none of this would have ever happened." Even after turning 75 in 2021, Roger wanted to keep working for as long as he could, whether it meant volunteering at his church or continuing being a minister at hospitals. He wanted to keep on his feet and be able to help others. As for Dr. Cubria, he was said to look pretty rough during trial, just losing weight, having a whole different appearance. Roger described how throughout their time at Edgewater, Cubria didn't have a good relationship with his children and that he tried buying their affection with things like vacations, golf clubs, and whatever else. But he said how his children visited him all the time while in prison in Ohio and told him that they loved him. It was only then that Cubria realized that they didn't want his money, they just wanted his time. Roger further went on to describe that there was a soft side to Cubria, how he gave money to charity and he often paid when going out to dinner with colleagues and just other things. Cubria ended up developing brain cancer in prison, and in 2012, he passed away at 61 years old. As of 2023, Dr. Rao, Dr. Kris, and Dr. Barnabas still have an active license according to the website for the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. Dr. Barnabas showed that his license is still active, with the most effective date being April 12, 2023, and with the expiration date being July 31st, 2026. Dr. Rao's one was a bit confusing because on some sources, his first name is listed as Sheshikiri, but on other sources, his name is listed as Seshagiri. And when I typed his last name into the license checker, only one person popped up, and it was the latter first name. According to this, it appears that his license is on probation, with the first effective date being April 8th, 2023, and expiration July 31st, 2026. He does have one that's active, though, called Licensed Physician Controlled Substance. Similar to Dr. Kris, except his effective date is April 6, 2023, and Dr. Kuliana was the doctor who is retired as his license expired on September 30th, 2020. After his prison release, Barnabas worked for a man named Ravir Nayak. This was a man who owned a bunch of Chicago area surgical centers who just so happened to get in trouble and serve 2 years in prison for paying kickbacks to doctors. He even was involved in this incident called the U.S. Senate seat scandal, where it was said he had offered to pay the then Illinois governor for the Senate seat of Barack Obama. So, he bribed the governor. He was arrested for paying kickbacks, and this was the man that Barnabas went to work with after getting out of prison. As for the Edgewater building, the area is now called Anderson Point Apartments. The former hospital rooms now house 155 apartments, like said. Many former employees got new work at nearby area hospitals, and many staff and community members just want Edgewater to be remembered as a place with hardworking staff who cared for patients, a place with so much potential to be a good educational building, make new medical discoveries, and properly treat patients. It just had a select few corrupt individuals who prioritized profits over patients. It was noted that changes need to be made in the system. One person mentioned the fact that it's strange that a CEO of a hospital can make so much money, yet a doctor at said hospital who went through so many years of school and training comparatively would be making pennies. Money became the main care for these select few individuals. There were many competent doctors. There just so happened to be a handful of incompetent doctors mixed with fraudsters, as, quote, greed and incompetence destroyed such a good place. They said how bad apples destroyed the reputation of the hospital. That's not their legacy. And this was just a story of how some individuals came together to take advantage of the healthcare system. But yes, that is it for today's video. This case was definitely such a complex one. There's just so much going on. And honestly, it's wild that this would even happen and continues to happen. I again would like to thank Todd Gans and Stephanie Young from the If the Walls Could Talk podcast. Please go support. The information to their website and Patreon is in the description. Please let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any videos on medical cases, mysteries, and history. Bye now.